So now, a week or so after the terrible massacre in Sydney, Australia, the Australian government is considering doing some sensible things like limiting the number of guns that any person in Australia can own, but also considering doing some things that would be really fundamental violations of people's rights to free speech. Among them, the Premier of New South Wales, the Australian state that controls, that encompasses Sydney, I said that he wants to ban the phrase globalize the intifada. Now, this is really stupid and dangerous at a number of levels. First of all, does anyone really think that banning the phrase globalize the intifada would have stopped this father and son who were evidently connected to ISIS from having committed this terrible attack? If these people had an ISIS ideology, banning the phrase globalize the intifada would do absolutely nothing to prevent them from committing this heinous terrorist attack. On its face, it's just ridiculous to think that banning this phrase would have done anything to prevent the terrible violence that occurred. But beyond that, it's simply a grave violation of people's basic fundamental rights to say that you can't use the phrase globalize the intifada. Intifada is an Arabic word that means uprising. It doesn't mean uprising against Israel or Jews. It means uprising in general. The Arab Spring was often referred to as an intifada. An intifada, like any uprising or any revolutionary political movement, can be violent or nonviolent. The first Palestinian intifada in the late 1980s was largely nonviolent. The second one in the early 2000s was much more violent. It can be violent or nonviolent. So yes, globalized intifada could be interpreted as a call for violence. It could also be interpreted as a call for for an uprising that's not violent. But even if globalize the intifada is interpreted or meant by the speaker as a call for violence, we allow people to call for violence on the streets all the time. Threatening violence against one individual person is one thing, but saying you support violence in general in some kind of political context is not at all. If people protest in defense of Ukraine's right to fight against Russia and protest for their government to give arms to Ukraine, they're protesting in support of the Ukrainians using violence in that cause. The fact that it's a call for violence doesn't mean that it should be banned. Similarly, if someone goes out in a protest and says Israel has the right to defend itself, I stand with the IDF in the wake of what Israel's been doing in Gaza, those are endorsements of violence. People have the right to say those things. People have the right to participate in political speech, and in political speech around a whole range of different things. People often endorse violence of various forms that they believe will serve their political ends. Sometimes those calls for violence are odious. Sometimes those calls for violence, as let's say in the case of Ukraine, might be ones that are widely supported. But the point is that people have the right to make that kind of political speech. You know, I still remember when it was conservatives, including many Jewish conservatives, who would say, in response to what they felt like were the excesses of the woke, quote unquote, woke left, who were trying to restrict speech on college campuses, that would say again and again that speech is not violence. And that's actually true. At least speech that endorses violence in a broad sense, right? Again, I'm not talking about violence directed at a particular individual in a particular moment, but people who endorse the idea of violence in some broader sense, that speech is not in and of itself violence, right? If you say, I supported the Iraq war, right? That was a call for violence. It was not violence in and of itself. And this distinction is completely being collapsed in this case. Again, this is even if you assume the harshest interpretation of the phrase, which is that it is a call for violence, which some people who would use that phrase would strongly contest. I think a lot of this reminds me of this now famous book that Naomi Klein wrote called The Shock Doctrine, in which in the wake of a shock, in which people are traumatized and angry and afraid, you take advantage of that to push through things that you've been wanting to push through for ages, but you now have the political opportunity to do so in a time when reason often goes out the window and you can appeal to people's emotions and fears. We saw this, of course, in the United States after September 11th with the passage of the Patriot Act. To a different degree, we saw this after October 7th in the United States with a massive crackdown on free speech of rights of people to protest on university campuses and elsewhere that I think historians will look back on now, as they do on the post 9/11 era, as a period of very serious infractions of people's rights to free speech, the firing of professors, the deportation of students on foreign visas because they had made politically controversial statements. All of this stuff is now what is being attempted to be reenacted in Australia by Australian government, by Israeli politicians, and by pro-Israel organizations. None of this will do anything to make Australian Jews safer. What it will do is exactly what it did in the United States after September 11th, what it did in the 1950s in the hysteria in the wake in the McCarthy era after during the Korean War, and what it has done since October 7th. It will do in Australia what it's done in America, which is not to make anyone safer, but to make the country less free. And when you start to violate people's basic rights to free speech for one political purpose, you open the door to people start doing that in many, many arenas. So if you can ban the phrase globalize the intifada because that people find that phrase threatening and they say that a speech that could support violence is in itself violence, you are opening the door to lots and lots of other people going around and trying to restrict your speech on the same grounds. And that's the way in which countries become less free. That is what has happened in the United States over the last 25 years. And I think Australians should think long and hard about whether they want to go down our path now in the wake of this terrible massacre in Sydney.